This week, the NFL Scouting Combine is taking place in Indianapolis, but all eyes for the Jets are on the search for a new veteran quarterback. We're talking the latest from the Jets quarterback rumor mill today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 2nd, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps the podcast out and helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, today we are talking the latest from the Jets' search for a new quarterback. Of course, the two big names out there are Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr. This week is the NFL Scouting Combine, so the best prospects are in Indianapolis, but along with them are front office members, coaches, agents, essentially everybody who's anybody in the NFL is in Indianapolis this week. And because of that, while these teams will obviously pay a lot of attention to what happens during the drills, during the one-on-one interviews, the medical reports that come out of this week is about the prospects, but you'd be surprised. A lot of what happens this week is actually about what's going to happen in free agency and trades and the rest of the offseason that's upcoming with players already in the league. And the reason for that is everybody's in Indianapolis. In fact, I've heard this from multiple agents through the years. This surprised me, and this is, it's not really major insider information, but it was interesting to me, so I'll share it with you. This is typically the week every year where teams really start to make their decisions about whether they're going to keep certain players or get rid of them, and that's particularly true of players who are kind of on the roster bubble, players who make a lot of money, who could be cuts for salary cap reasons. This is apparently the week, and again, this surprised me, so I'll just share it, so I'll just let you know. This is the point in time where front office members, general managers go to agents and ask, would your player be willing to accept a pay cut? And if he is, this is usually the week where the groundwork is laid. And if not, this is the week where teams decide that they're ready to move on from players. So there's actually a lot on the pro personnel side that's set up this week. And for the Jets, obviously a lot's going on at the quarterback position. And there were a couple developments with both Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr. So we can begin with Aaron Rodgers. This is the guy everybody wants, except me. So you're in good company if you disagree with me. But Aaron Rodgers, of course, has emerged from his darkness retreat. And an interesting note is, and you always have to take these rumors with a grain of salt, but a reporter from The Athletic, the great digital website that covers all kinds of sports, Vic Tafur, has reported that the Raiders have ruled out trying to trade for Aaron Rodgers if he decides to leave the Green Bay Packers. So at this point in time, and things can always change, but in this point in time, it looks like the Jets might be the only potential suitor for Aaron Rodgers. Now, however, we don't know what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers. And the Jets, when I say they're the only potential suitor, that's if Aaron Rodgers wants out of Green Bay and if the Packers want to move on from him, which is not clear at this point, and part of the reason it's not clear is that despite the fact he's emerged from his darkness retreat, Aaron Rodgers has still not made a decision yet on his future. And he said that he doesn't want to drag this out. He's running out of time, though. I can understand a step in your life as drastic as potentially changing teams, leaving the only team you've ever known when you've been with them since 2005, potentially retiring, leaving a game that you've played for decades. I understand this is a big event, but you also have to consider what the information teams need to know and the time frame they need to know it in. And it's not like the Packers season ended yesterday. It's not like the Packers season ended last week. Aaron Rodgers has had about a month and a half to decide what he wants to do. Now, I think he's got a little bit more time, but I think to be courteous to the Packers and to be courteous to other teams like the Jets, he really needs to make a decision over the next couple of days. He's hinted that he might do that. And I think for the Jets, this has reached a point in time, and listen, I understand. You may not want to listen to what I have to say. In fact, there's a good chance if you're a big Rodgers fan, you may just completely zoom past this first segment where I talk about Aaron Rodgers. But I feel like even in a world where I was more in favor of the Jets making a big move for Aaron Rodgers, we've kind of reached a point where there are a couple of things at play here. First of all, is that if the Jets are the only team that's interested in trading for Rodgers, it kind of limits what you would expect they'd have to give to Green Bay. And, there's all these rumors out there. I've heard some rumors that they'd have to give up a big package to get Rodgers. Well, if they're the only suitor, and you have to remember, this is not a favorable contract. I mean, you could be the biggest proponent of getting Rodgers in the world. I think even you'd have to admit his contract is not very good. You may argue that it's worth doing, but nobody's saying that this is a good contract you're acquiring. So you're the only suitor. You're the only team at this point, and that could change tomorrow, but at this point you're the only team that's really expressed much interest. Why would you have to give up a lot for him? It's to a point where you wonder why, if Green Bay's got to give him up, because this is kind of a salary dump for Green Bay, even though they'd be hit with a big dead money figure. So you feel like at this point the Jets should not have to give up much for Rodgers. Maybe they will, but I don't think they should have to. And I'll say this: it would make me feel easier about a trade. It would not completely alleviate my concerns, because, to be honest with you, my concerns are more about just the contract. It's a bad contract, but it's one thing to take on a bad contract. It's another thing to give up premium resources to take on a bad contract. It's a little bit easier to live with just the taking on the bad contract part if you don't have to give up a lot. But again, I think the time frame for this really needs to be condensed, because Derek Carr is out there, and a logical time frame for Derek Carr to resolve things. Now, I know there were rumors that Derek Carr wanted to resolve this thing before the combine. Obviously that's not going to happen, but I think it's logical for Derek Carr to want this to be wrapped up in the next week or two, because if we hit the legal tampering period, even though there are really no free agents to be who are better than him, this is assuming Lamar Jackson doesn't hit free agency. Once you hit the legal tampering period, teams can start talking to other options. They can start moving on to their plan B. So Carr is to the point where, you're probably going to get a decision at some point. It could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be a week from now, but we're probably looking at a conclusion at some point in the next 2 weeks, because there's only so long this can drag out for. So I think if you're the Jets, you need Rodgers to make a decision. And I think it's true of Green Bay also, but it's time for Rodgers to make a decision, because the worst thing that could happen with the Jets is they let Rodgers string this thing out. They let Rodgers string them along and just keep going, and then Carr goes off the market, and then Rodgers thinks he has leverage. I think if you're the Jets, you kind of have to have a decision soon. And listen, if Rodgers decides tomorrow, I want to come to the Jets, that's one thing. But I think the Jets, and I've seen this happen with the Jets before, where they're essentially they've been used as leverage so many times through the years. A player just essentially pretended they were interested in the Jets to try and get another team to raise their price. You don't want Aaron Rodgers to do that to you if you're the Jets. And I guess the other aspect of this is part of the thing that I've been thinking the last couple of days is we don't even know how interested Rodgers is in coming to the Jets, because there's been a lot of talk about Green Bay potentially wanting to move on from Rodgers. There's been a lot of talk about Rodgers potentially wanting to move on from Green Bay. There's been talk about the Jets wanting Rodgers if he moves on from Green Bay. What we have not heard much of is how interested Aaron Rodgers is in actually coming to the Jets. Is moving to New York something that he'd be interested in? And, none of us can really answer this at this point in time. Rodgers has not really given us much of an indication, but he's had now a month and a half to really think through his plans. And I feel like he should understand the time frame. Listen, he's in the NFL. He even said it. He's even said it this week, that he doesn't want to drag this out forever. So I think if Rodgers really wanted to be a member of the Jets, we'll know in the next couple of days, because he understands everything, that all the other factors that go into it. And I think that's the time frame the Jets need to have a decision from him on. I think the Jets want to get this quarterback thing, and they should want to get this quarterback thing wrapped up very early in the offseason so they can focus on their other needs, so that they'll know what their financial structure is going to be going forward. So I think one way or another, this thing needs to resolve itself, and the Jets need to get an answer from Aaron Rodgers. And if he just keeps dragging his feet, then I think you can just move on and you go to plan B, which could be Derek Carr. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about Carr. He's meeting with a number of teams this week. He's met with the Jets. What could this all mean? Well, we'll try and figure it out as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Of course, it is the NFL offseason. We're talking about getting ready for free agency. We're talking about players who could be available in trades. And we're talking about the scouting combine because the draft is fast approaching. Well, you should know that we're in the middle of the NBA season. And it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook if you want to bet on games, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. Even though the eyes of the NFL this week are on the prospects who will be competing in the Combine in Indianapolis, there's lots of talk on the pro personnel front. Part of that is because the entire league is gathered in Indianapolis, so this is a chance to kind of lay the groundwork. It's a chance to talk about players who may be available, players who may need to have their salary cuts, chance to talk with other teams about potential trades. And quite frankly, and I'm not going to throw out any specific accusations, but you can bet that we have what's known as the legal tampering period coming up in a few weeks. With all these front office types and agents around, you can probably bet that there's some illegal tampering happening in Indianapolis this week as we approach free agency. There's nothing illegal, though, about talking with Derek Carr. He can't be tampered with because he does not belong to an NFL team right now since the Raiders have cut him. And he's met with multiple teams this week. There was a meeting with the Saints. There's a meeting with the Panthers. The Panthers said good things about him. And there was a second meeting with the Jets this week, and it was on the schedule. So there's plenty of speculation about that. And one of the things that's worth noting is that by most accounts, Woody Johnson is going to be part of these meetings with Carr. So I think we can kind of surmise here that if Woody Johnson's getting involved, things are getting serious. I don't know the extent to which Woody's actually involved. Listen, I certainly hope he's not playing a major role in any of these negotiations, but I think in any situation, and I don't love defending Woody, but you may hear that Woody Johnson's involved in meeting with Derek Carr. I think with almost any team, the owner is probably going to be involved in a meeting like this. I think that's probably going to be the case. Now, you hope Woody's not like the one directing traffic. You hope Woody's not the one making not the one negotiating the contract. That should fall to Joe Douglas. Woody's the guy that's there to sign the checks. But I think Woody's a guy. You meet the owner. You kind of learn who the boss is. I think that's a natural step here in this process. And ultimately, Carr's probably going to make, as I said, Carr's probably going to make his decision in the next week or two. Now, we did not get much information from Joe Douglas when he spoke to the media earlier in the week. Typically, either your head coach or your GM, or sometimes both, speak to the media at the Combine before the festivities begin. And I have to be honest with you, I kind of wonder why they have these press conferences, because you almost never get anything useful. Occasionally, like your GM will give you like something that'll give you kind of a sense of what he values in players. He may say, well, our scheme requires an athletic tackle or something along those lines. So I guess occasionally you get something interesting, but most of these press conferences are just, the media asking you about what your offseason plans are, and no GM's going to tell you what his offseason plans are before the offseason even begins. So Joe Douglas, and I want to make it clear, like, this may sound like I'm being critical of Joe Douglas. It's not. I'm actually pretty impressed by how disciplined he was. I mean, this was a tour de force in just coming up with cliche after cliche after cliche. Nothing but generic talk from Joe Douglas. But based on what we know, it sounds like the Jets are very interested in Derek Carr. And for me, that's a change, because the Jets, and I'll give the Jets credit for this, the Jets held their cards close in the early part of this offseason. It got to the point where I really was not sure that they were even interested in Derek Carr, because there was no buzz about them. And, sometimes what that means is that the teams are just quiet. And that's why you always have to take what happens, all these rumors with a grain of salt, because you don't know what's going to happen. Now, there was talk, there was a report out today from a report out yesterday from a national reporter that the Saints are ready to make a move on Derek Carr. And right now it seems like the Jets and the Saints are the two biggest teams. The Panthers did meet with Carr, but there's a lot of buzz. And again, this could change because it's a rumor, but and Frank Reich, the Panthers head coach, did say good things about Carr. But there's a lot of talk about the Panthers looking for a more moderate option, or the Panthers potentially looking to the draft. So at this point, it seems like, and this is logical because these were the two teams that reportedly called the Raiders about a potential trade for Carr. These are the two teams that we know Carr has visited their facility. They're the Jets and the Saints. And it's a tough spot for both teams because both teams are kind of up against the salary cap. Neither team has a ton of cap space to spare. Despite what Joe Douglas told you earlier this week, Douglas told you the Jets have a lot of flexibility, which I guess is true if they want to push some cap hits to the future, which they could do. They could restructure contracts, lower the 2023 cap hit, and push some of the money to the future that they're saving. But if it comes down to the Jets and the Saints, and it's about money, the Jets probably do have a leg up because as much as they're up against the salary cap, they can probably afford to free up more space, even if it's pushing money to the future, than the Saints can right now. And that's a result of the way the Saints run their salary cap. It's kind of a philosophical thing. The Saints like to cram many good players as they can onto their roster, and they create these massive cap hits in future years. As a result, they reduce cap hits in the short term in exchange for creating massive cap hits in the future. Jets will have to do a little bit of this to create room for Derek Carr, but they really have not run their team like this up until now, which means the Saints have a lot of money on their cap from past seasons. That was money that they pushed to future years, and now the future is now for the Saints. Whereas the Jets really do have some... I don't love the term flexibility in a situation like this because you are pushing money to the future, and it's money that you're not going to be able to cut in the future. But the Jets do have a degree of wiggle room here to create the cap space that they need to sign Derek Carr. So if it comes down to just money, I'm not sure it's entirely going to come down to money. I think, when you're talking about free agents, there are three things that come into play. First of all is fit and the roles that you could get. Now, with Carr, he's going to be the starting quarterback, so I'm not sure that comes into play. The second thing that comes into play typically is money, and that could be a big factor. The third is just organization. The organization. Do you believe in the owner? Do you believe, and that's where Woody Johnson's meeting yesterday hopefully comes in and hopefully does good things for the Jets, although I understand if you're a little pessimistic about Woody. And just in terms of culture, has the coaching staff built something you want to be part of? Do you think the GM is creating a stability in your franchise? Can you win? Things along those lines. So in the first area, either team's going to make Carr their starting quarterback. It doesn't really apply. The Jets could probably win on money. Now it's up to the Jets, if they want Carr, to sell their organization, to tell them that, we may have missed the playoffs 12 straight years. We may not have had a winning season since 2015, but we got things on the right track and you're the missing piece. By all accounts, this was a very good visit that Carr had, not this past weekend, a couple weekends ago, but now they have to seal the deal. And part of this is, deciding what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers. And we've reached the point, I think, where the Jets need to make a decision what direction they're going in the next few days. And as I said in the first segment, I think that the Jets need to decide, and I think essentially it comes down to this: if Rodgers wants to be here, the Jets might work out a trade for him. But I think there has to be a hard deadline on the Rodgers stuff because Carr is going to be gone in a week or two, so the Jets need to make a call. And it seems like the Jets like Carr. It seems like they're very comfortable with Carr, so that could be the direction they move in. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll actually talk about the Combine because that's the big focus this week. I'm going to give you my annual warning, though, so just beware. My annual warning: don't read too much into the Combine. There are a few things it's useful for, though. I'll explain what they are as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. The drills begin today at the NFL Scouting Combine. The Combine unofficially began Tuesday. Players began arriving. Teams arrived. GMs and coaches, some of them spoke to the media, including Joe Douglas. But today's the focus. 3 p.m. Eastern Time, NFL Network, the first of the drills gets underway. You'll start to measure the players, how they do in these drills. Some of them will be timed. Some of them will be recorded. So we'll see which players do well. It's my annual warning. Just don't read too much into it. So I used to think the Combine was useless. I don't think that anymore. I do think that there's some utility to the Combine. I just think film is more important than what happens at the Combine. I think the Combine can help you in a couple areas. The first area is one that we'll never see. And that's just interviews. Teams get to speak with players if there are some concerns they may have about a player, or just, if they want to gauge how well a player understands their system, things along those lines. interviews can be helpful. Interviews happen at the Combine. Some of them have already happened at the Senior Bowl. Sometimes you'll bring a player into your facility. It's just another step in the process. Another thing the Combine can be useful for is to eliminate players. And I think one of the dangers you get into, and this is especially true when the wide receivers take the field, a guy runs like a 4.3 40, and you say, well, that guy's got number one receiver potential. That's not necessarily the case. Time speed in a straight line is but one aspect of playing wide receiver. It's nice to have elite straight line speed out of starting blocks, not even from a stance that you'd run out of when you're lining up at wide receiver. It's nice to have, but it's not essential. And we've seen this through the years with the Jets, just having great time speed doesn't necessarily make you a good player. However, if you run like a 4.8, 4.9, odds are you're not going to be much of an NFL player. So in that sense, it matters. It's not so much that the guys who run really well are locks to be great players, but the guys who run really poorly, they're almost a lock to not be a great player. There's a certain threshold you just can't hit, and that's true at many different positions. So that's something to keep in mind. If a guy's a particularly bad combine, that could be a red flag, more than a guy playing great necessarily is. Although I do think that there's also utility in using it to kind of confirm your biases or disprove your biases that you have on tape. If you're watching a guy and you weren't entirely sure about his speed, the Combine can tell you that. Heading into the Combine last year, I loved Garrett Wilson. There was a lot that I thought was great about him. And one question was his speed. And he answered those questions. He ran in the 4.3s. I think another area where this could come into play is when you're dealing with small school prospects in particular. And the reason for that is sometimes a small school prospect dominates, and the reason he dominates is he's playing against guys who just aren't very good, guys who have no shot at making the NFL, and it's a big fish in the small pond scenario. So a guy from a small school, for me, that's a more important test than somebody from a major conference, because the major conference guys, you can kind of get a better sense of how football athletic they are, how football fast they are, how football strong they are. You can't tell that as much. It's easy enough in the lower levels if you're a good enough prospect to just dominate because you're the only guy who's even in the vicinity of being an NFL prospect. So a guy like some guys from smaller schools, I think it's a worthwhile measuring stick to see how they do in the Combine. So these are the areas where I think the Combine matters. But don't view it as a guy has bad film and he dominates the Combine, and now suddenly you're viewing him as an entirely different prospect. Now, there are some guys who are late bloomers. There are some guys who, don't do much in college and who develop in the NFL. And obviously, being more athletic is better than being less athletic. So, but you just have to keep these things in context. I think what happens is instead of somebody putting in a good combine and you say, well, let me look back on the tape to see if I missed anything, people just see somebody have a great combine and they say, well, this guy must be a great prospect. And of course, we know that's not the case. The phrase workout warrior has almost become a cliche in NFL circles. So these are just things to keep in mind as you watch the Combine this weekend. If you watch it, I mean, it's not a very entertaining event. So you can get all the results the next day by going online or, reading the paper or something. So if you want to watch the Combine, I think these are just things to keep in mind because very easy to read too much into what happens out there. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I am saying that it's reached a point where there's so much coverage of it, it's oversaturated, and maybe we get a little carried away. So just as long as you keep everything in perspective and it's worthwhile, and those are the things that I would keep in perspective. That's the context I would view the Combine in. Now, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Hope you have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out our week and talk more Jets.